Right, good afternoon, everybody. Let's get this afternoon's session underway. My name is Richard Sambrook. I'm a Professor of Journalism at Cardiff University and moderating this session. I also chaired an independent media council which published a working paper on this subject of media and open government that came out a couple of weeks ago. Before we get underway, however, I'm delighted to welcome our host for this summit, Britain's Cabinet Office Minister, Francis Maude, who's going to say a few words to get us underway. Francis.
Well, Richard, thank you very much indeed. And I just want to say a very quick word at the outset. I'm very glad that the Media Council has been set up and exists and is has produced this very good report. There was a sense quite early on in the history of the Open Government Partnership that the role of the media in all of this is absolutely essential, and it'd be really helpful to have some deep, serious thinking about the relationships. It is, of course, a fundamental tenet of open government that you must have a free media. It's one of the requirements, and alongside a right to information and so on. But we've all noticed a worrying tendency in governments when confronted with the prospect of opening up and having greater transparency around the role of the media. I said this morning in my remarks in the plenary, all governments are never monolithic. There are reformers and resistors. And one of the concerns always expressed by those who resist change and resist openness is a concern that all you're doing by opening up is giving ammunition to a media which is often hostile to governments, which is a perfectly healthy thing. I don't enjoy it, but it's kind of part of life. And you're opening up and giving ammunition to your opponents. Which is why it's really important that the media takes an approach to governments which do open up, which is not in any sense asking for an easy ride or to pull the punches, but to understand that if the result of opening up is just absolutely relentless use of data which government has voluntarily released, it can actually lead to governments becoming even more closed than they were. And it was really nice, actually, at the session I did this morning when the public policy editor of The Guardian, which is not normally a supporter of the current coalition government in Britain, issued a very warm note of congratulation to the coalition government in Britain about the amount of data we release. It was actually really nice to hear that. But I think the thought to our media partners in all of this is never underestimate how difficult this is for governments to do, how far out of the comfort zone it is for governments voluntarily to open up. All governments have a default setting, which is to be closed and secretive. And making that break is tough to do. So I think exploiting the data, exploiting the information is absolutely a fundamental part of a free media, and reporting and analyzing and exposing based on it. But that needs to, I would say, to be balanced with some support for governments and those elements within governments who do take this path of starting the opening up, because it's sometimes, as I said this morning, it can sometimes feel quite lonely and quite beleaguered, and a bit of backing for those who go down this path is welcome. So just a few thoughts to start off with. Thanks very much.
Indeed, Francis. This session then is going to be looking at the relationship between the media and open government. The working paper report found that there was a large degree of ignorance amongst journalists around the world. We did an international survey. More than 70% hadn't heard of the OGP. and it was coupled with some scepticism about the depth of government commitments to greater transparency. But equally, of course, the media face their own challenges, both in skills and resources to properly report open government, and indeed in being accountable and transparent themselves. So, as a consequence, are the public less well informed than they should be? Can the media ever be partners in the aims of the open government movement, or are media and government fixed as adversaries? Those are some of the issues we will be discussing, but we're happy to open it up into any issue that touches on the questions of media and open government. And we have a terrific panel here to begin the discussion. I'll introduce them in a moment and then invite each of them to speak for 5 minutes, and then we'll open it up to the audience here. I already know there are 1 or 2 people who want to come in and respond. I'm sure there will be more. And I've invited anybody watching the live stream to contact me via Twitter @Sambrook, and we can bring in questions and views from outside the room as well if anybody's moved to do so. So let me quickly introduce the panel. At the far end there we have Dr. Jacqueline Pechard, who is a commissioner for the Federal Institute for Access to Information and Data Protection in Mexico. We then have Justin Arenstein, who is a media strategist with the African Media Initiative. We have Yuli Ismartono, who is the Deputy Chief Editor of the English weekly news and current affairs magazine Tempo in Indonesia. We have John Lloyd, who is a contributing editor to the Financial Times and is Director of Journalism at the Reuters Institute for the Study of Journalism at Oxford University. And on my left immediately here is Professor James T. Hamilton, who is Professor of Communication and Director of the Journalism Programme at Stanford, and who has written on this. Indeed, Jay co-edited a book that's available outside that John also contributed to. So we have people with real depth of experience across the piece on this subject. And I wonder, Jay, if I could maybe turn to you first to start us off.
Sure. Well, thank you very much. On his first day in office, this may surprise people, President Obama issued a memorandum calling for the government to be more transparent, participatory, and collaborative. And in many government areas, that has been true. If you look at the data sets that the government is releasing in the US on data.gov, they're encouraging the release of information that helps you hold institutions outside of government accountable, like polluters. And if you look at the information that the government is releasing that helps businesses build businesses and generate jobs, in the US, this strategy is called DC to VC for venture capital. The government has done a good job trying to help generate data that will help you in your life as a worker, producer, or consumer. But in your life as a voter, the US government has done much less well in providing you with the information that allows you to hold the US government accountable. And that's not surprising, because information is power, that if you think about the advantages that the government has in terms of hidden action and hidden information, that translates into a more freedom of action for government officials. But there are things that the media can do to try to pull more information out of government that would help you as a voter hold government accountable. And I think there are 4 things that the media could do. The first one is to articulate how government could better release information that would help reporters in their accountability journalism. Richard referred to the book that the Reuters Institute for the Study of Journalism is releasing this week called Transparency in Politics in the Media. In that book, journalists like Sarah Cohen and Jennifer LaFleur from the US write about the hurdles that they have faced in writing investigative reports about the US, and they specify clearly things that the government could do to make investigative journalism easier, such as the release of standardized machine-readable data, the release of the true artifacts of governing, calendars, contracts, personnel records, rather than the release of a second set of books, which often happens when you request information, and starting from the presumption that data should be open. A second thing that journalists can do is write about the successes and the failures of open government. In the US, the publishers have picked a week that they call Sunshine Week, where people write about the stories that they have found by using the Freedom of Information Act, and they also use it as a time to call out governments who haven't released data. So having many different papers across the country write during 1 week about the successes or failures has put this issue on the agenda. A third thing that the media can do is develop better skills in data journalism, because once the data are released, you still have to discover the stories. And there in the US, universities like Columbia, Berkeley, Northwestern, and Stanford are trying to help pioneer a field called computational journalism, which is essentially trying to lower the cost of discovering stories through better use of data and algorithms. And then the fourth thing that the media could do is be more transparent themselves, because if you're trying to get others to adhere to a norm of transparency, you have more credibility if you are transparent. Two ways that that's being done in the US. One is through an engine called Document Cloud, which is currently hosted at Investigative Reporters and Editors. That's a platform that allows you to write a story and then link directly to the documents that underlie that story. That's a way to build credibility with your readers. And a second thing that some documentary filmmakers, particularly in public broadcasting, are doing is trying to make the underlying interviews that they've done available on the web and searchable, so that, again, people can see how you reached your conclusions. And a best practices example of that would be Frontline, which, for instance, on a 2-hour documentary called Money, Power, and Greed, posted 16 hours of interviews that they did behind that. So in sum, the media can focus attention on the lack of government accountability information by saying what it needs, showing how the government does or doesn't release the data, develop data journalism skills, and be transparent itself. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jay. So 4 really clear suggestions there, articulating how government can release information in a more helpful way, putting open government on the agenda, developing data journalism skills, and being more transparent both in their reporting and perhaps as organisations. John, would you like to pick that up?
Thanks, Richard. I wanted to pick up in the report from the Open Government Partnership. There's a piece which lays out the challenges for the media. And they are indeed huge challenges, as to recognise open government as a rich area of relevance, to recognise accountability journalism can be as much about promoting good government, and so on. And they're huge challenges because they actually run against the grain of what's been happening in the media for the last 20 or 30 years, perhaps longer. And that grain has tended to be, if you like, anti-politics, or at least anti the analysis and even the reporting of politics, especially true in this country, but it's not just this country. The BBC is an exception to that, but certainly the press is not. So that the coverage of government, of politics, of policies, of political parties themselves, the kind of stuff which makes the law of the land what it is and surrounds the citizens with what they must do and obey and how they develop, that's now very small in the mainstream media, and politics is now covered to a very large degree, especially in popular papers. The more popular papers, the less politics are covered. It's covered by scandal and personality. It's true of nearly all popular papers. It's true to quite a large degree of broadcasting, with exceptions. And actually, it's increasingly true in upmarket papers, apart from the very specialist ones, read by people who've got to know the fact. Increasingly, politics is scandalized and personalized. This is true in most of the democratic world. It's perhaps most true in this country. It's arguable how true it is elsewhere. I think the big newspapers in the United States have retained a strong reportorial tradition, but they are mainly in trouble, like newspapers are everywhere. Secondly, much more information is now available. One can find facts quickly and easily. The main issue is navigation. But that again plays to specialist journalism. There's specialist websites now, which are very good, many of them, and very often written not by journalists, but by academics and other such people. Government itself is part of this. Government is putting a lot more, as Francis Maude referred to, government's putting a lot more of stuff out there, and most governments in democratic countries have got Freedom of Information Acts, which allow journalists to mine much more information. Does this hold government to account? Yes, it does, quite substantially. Government is now held much more to account than it was before, partly because of the amount of information, partly because more journalists are aware of where to get that information and how to use it, how to put it to governments. The largest question, I think, for government and for the media is if it is true that the mainstream media are not doing these big stories, these huge issues which are now facing politicians and governments everywhere, which are at least as challenging as they've ever been since the war and possibly even before, if these are not being explained apart from in elite publications and websites, how then are we to get assent? How is government to get assent from a population which is underinformed or possibly simply uninterested? Finally, the largest question, I think now, and it's one which is particularly relevant in this country and in the United States, is how far do the revelations of the whistleblowers, WikiLeaks some time ago now and Snowden now, how far do the media, which most people read, watch, and explain, how far do they put that in, and how far are the revelations of the whistleblowers in the public interest? And there's two very strongly contrasting views, and I don't think they can be reconciled. And neither one, I think, can wish the other away. One, from the revealers and from the whistleblowers themselves, is that the public has a right to know, and what has been revealed has been redacted so skillfully and so closely that there is no danger to, say, security operatives in the field, or indeed anybody else, or the public, from terrorists getting to know things which they shouldn't, because the information which they could use has been redacted out. And the other side to this is, which comes from governments and security services, but also from others as well, is that no journalist can possibly know what is useful to terrorists and what is not, and therefore there is huge danger in putting this stuff in the public domain, especially if it's put into newspapers. It's clearly in the public's interest to know how we're being surveyed, clearly in Mrs. Merkel's and Mrs. Rousseff's interest to know that the Americans are listening to their phone calls, but it's also in our interest to know that people are able to stop terrorist actions before they happen. And what, for journalists, is a very large statement that Glenn Greenwald and The Guardian and others have said, and that is, we can give you more material which it is your right to know and safeguard your security, is a huge statement, quite a remarkable statement for journalism to make, and it's one which I think we have to unpack and debate within journalism, but also within society in general, for some time to come.
John, thank you very much. So, setting up really a very stark and sometimes contentious views over the recent whistleblowing coverage there, but also questioning whether mainstream media is really fulfilling its public interest responsibilities in terms of informing the public. The report that John referred to there, I should say, was an independent report. It's not part of the OGP. It was funded by Omidyar Network, but indeed not influenced by them. It was an independent review from a media council and from a global survey of journalists. On that media council was our next speaker, Yuli Ismartono. Yuli.
Thank you, Richard. I would like to speak about the case of Indonesia because it represents, one, a developing country, a democratizing country, particularly in Southeast Asia, on how it needs and wants to apply transparency and openness, especially in the government, but how difficult the enormous challenges that it faces. Indonesia, for one, is a huge country of 245 million, and its size, imagine it's as wide as the U.S. West Coast to the East Coast, most of it in water because we consist of 17,000 islands. But given the diversity, the diverse level of its socio-economy, there are poor people, majority, but they are very rich people. This disparity is very, very difficult to govern. And now we have the serious problem of corruption. We have the judiciary, we have the parliamentarians, and we have people in the executive branch committing corruptions. And then we have, as we are trying to democratize and we are trying to come to terms with pluralism in our country, it is also threatened because the government refuses to be open about certain things, as my colleague here said, for reasons of security, for reasons of whatnot, but certainly not being open enough. And this is the challenge that's faced by the OGI, the Open Government Indonesia, the body that was formed to lead OGP-related activities. Now, in the 2 years that they've been around, they've done a pretty good job, we think. They have tried to introduce programs, popularize the concept of transparency and openness. They've tried to introduce a competition among the local governments to find out who provides the best public services delivery. And so far, it's been participated by 62 local administrations, nothing given that we have more than 300 local administrations, of course. The competition has resulted in a few innovative initiatives, such as they have managed to get the trade minister to introduce a single window portal for application of business licenses, for instance. And most importantly, this unit has introduced a single portal on the website for the public to gain information on public services. One window, it's called Satu Layanan, and it is very popular for people who have access to internet, that is. And most importantly, because of the massive use of the internet and social media by the youth, the OGI has involved the youth in its activity. Many of them, in fact, are attending this summit on the, what is it that, the competition that they have? I'm not, one of the, Bright Spots, that's it, yeah. We've sent a delegate to them, sorry. So in this respect, the government should be given good grade, but a lot more still needs to be, is still needed. One shortcoming is that even though the president signed the OGP initiative, it is not being accepted warmly by his ministers. The OGI and the President's Delivery Unit for Monitoring and Supervision is doing its best, but getting not much help from other government agencies. So what we see here is a lack of synergy between the ministers to make it happen. So the result is often an overlapping of legislation, of regulations, and in fact, contradicting the very effort at initiating this transparency campaign. For example, a few years ago, we managed to get the Freedom of Information Act passed. And we were trying to enforce it because, as I said before, ministries were not willing to accept this, this requirement to be open to the public, to help them. Then all of a sudden, just recently, Parliament approved, after much protest from the NGOs and the opposition, a law called the Mass Organization Law, which restricts the movement of many civil society organizations, contradicting, again, the freedom to get information. And the Freedom of Information Act itself is having a difficult time in enforcing it. For example, when the public wants to gain information from the Justice Ministry about certain arrests or something on the police, we get no answer. There is no answer at all. And there's no enforcement to this law. Very little. Sometimes we succeed, but most of the time we don't. But most importantly, where the government is concerned, when they are about to purchase or to acquire something for their own ministries and they tender it out, there is no information whatsoever, which leads to a lot of massive corruption. And talk about the parliamentarians. They don't care and they don't want to know. So we have no support among their constituencies. And last but not least, not enough promotion and publicity on the activities, particularly reaching the public who have no access to internet. Yet we have radio, we have TV, but it's not being done. In short, in the eyes of the local media, what the OGI program needs is the political will and probably a good standard bearer. So the question rises, can the media be a partner to this effort, or is it always going to be seen as an adversary by the government? I think the first thing to do is, and what we have always tried to do, is to eliminate the mistrust between the media and the government right now. It's been going on for the last 12 years since we started the program on democratization and reforms. And most importantly, if the media is to be a partner in efforts like transparency and openness, one of the things that we need to do is to amend the legislation that criminalizes the press when it starts on writing or exposing information about the government. So I'll stop here, and maybe I can answer some questions later. Thank you, Richard.
Yuni, thank you very much. So a real sense of some of the on-the-ground frustrations there for press in Indonesia in trying to report open government, and a sense of perhaps government not always living up to some of the rhetoric. Next we have Justin Arenstein. Justin has some slides. It's easy for you to do it from the lectern and from the seat. It's up to you, Justin. Okay?
This is fine, yeah.
Over to you.
So I'm with something that's not an NGO and not a government initiative. I'm with an association of about 600 of the largest media companies in Africa, and they're banded together as something called AMI, which effectively is an association of dinosaur organizations. They understand that they're living in the past, that the collapse that we've heard people talk about around the media economy and advertising that underpins it, that's happened up here in the north, hasn't yet happened in Africa. So for once, this lag is actually playing in our favor. And we've started doing a lot of the things that you've heard about, the action points that were suggested for the US and elsewhere. And I want to quickly flip you through a couple of them. It's not going to be a slideshow. I'm just going to flip through some eye candy while we're talking, and maybe kind of highlight some of the things that we've learned along the way. Both media and government, to some extent, are facing a very similar crisis. We've lost touch with the people that we're supposed to be servicing and speaking on behalf of. And both of us are trying to reconnect with those audiences or with those constituencies. The way that the media are doing it through our program, which is Code for Africa, is that we've got three very strong principles that drive us. Firstly, that we've got to be citizen-focused. We've got to take things like information and data and ensure that it's something that people can base decisions on in their real lives. It's got to be actionable. Secondly, it's got to be demand-driven. A lot of the open data and open government movements and programs that we've seen up north and elsewhere, in Africa as well, where they're starting to emerge, is very well-intentioned, but it's effectively people saying, eat your broccoli. And eat your spinach, and they're shoving what's often unusable or irrelevant data at ordinary citizens, and then when there's no uptake, they don't understand why people are not engaging. And then thirdly, we've got to give people information that they can base real life-changing decisions and actions on. So it's got to be outcomes and output kind of focused. And this is not difficult. These three core principles we've built into our program to try and build a bit of an ecosystem so that it's not hit-and-run flagship projects, which is often also a problem with a very large institutional program where you need to have things to show people that you are delivering. And so you do 3 or 4 engagements and then you stand them up as examples. We're rather trying to build something far more difficult, which is a dynamic ecosystem that consists out of scores of partners, often some of whom are working at counter or cross purposes to each other, but finding small synergies between them and then amplifying those synergies. You'll see that there's a stark gap in those bunch of logos there. A lot of funding or grant-making organizations, a lot of associations and grassroots networks, very few civil society organizations. And we're doing a lot of the things that you heard the call for. We're teaching skills. We've got week-long immersive 100 people at a time in a room working with real data at workshops. They're citizens, they're journalists, they're data activists, and they're designers who then build things that can really be used. And those things that they build are often not technology and not gadgets. They're often just relationships that people go back to and then base those relationships on building larger projects or initiatives. They start creating a continental community where we initially seeded a couple of Hacks and Hackers chapters. These have now grown into a movement across the continent. They're in 14 countries at the moment, unfunded, volunteer-driven. They meet monthly, and they either liberate data, so it's not just building stuff. Often the bottleneck in my part of the world are the governments in the Open Government Partnership, releasing information that is so high level and often unstructured that it's unusable. So we have people going in and cleaning up that information, liberating what should be public, and then structuring it and putting it back into the public space, both for governments and for civil society to use. And in the process of doing that, they're starting to build some of the backbone that's necessary to build this new movement and this new economy on. So from our perspective as a media industry body, we're looking at this as building an open economy, an economy driven by data, which is almost an evolution of what the media's been doing in the past, where it was an information-based economy. Some of that includes using the tools that were mentioned, like Document Cloud, which we've got an instance up and running now outside of the US for obvious reasons, and where we're busy liberating deadwood information and turning that into not just something that you can look at when you read a news report. It actually turns it into machine-readable information. So you can extract entities, you can start creating linked data, and start powering civic apps as well as civic services off that. And building these kinds of tools, this is something from Ghana, where people built in 2 days, a bunch of citizens and hacktivists built a tool that tracked royalties paid by extractive industries that was supposed to go to villages and supposed to build schools. You can see all the zeros at the bottom. No infrastructure was built with the money. Previously, when the people had asked where the money's gone, they were told that the companies, the extractive companies, were holding on to it. The reality is that it got stuck in a subsection of government, hadn't been squandered, it was just sitting there accumulating interest. And then elsewhere, other examples from South Africa. But just going back to that, it's incredibly important to facilitate and to create the opportunity for people to build prototypes so that you can build proofs of concept so that people understand what's possible even if it's not going to scale. And then thirdly, these are just some media examples I'll flip through. But the next most important thing is then building hubs or centers where people can come together in an unstructured way to collaborate. And we've collaborated with a couple of tech incubators across the continent to create citizen labs, where citizens can come in with problems, and whether they be journalists or coders or technologists can then help them solve those problems. It's got to do with solving people's life problems that they face. The moment you do that, it becomes relevant and it becomes essential. And then finding ways of scaling any of those successes. So what's next? We've got code for programs running in those countries at the moment, or kicking off. Kenya is the most further advanced. And we're now collaborating with similar movements that are media-driven and media-funded in Latin America, and we're starting to forge relationships with similar co-collaborators in Europe as well. And exactly the same models being applied, obviously, with local tweaks. First, immersive skills, and then starting to build some of the backbone that's necessary to sustain and allow people to use those skills. So the point that I was trying to make was that we shouldn't necessarily, or we should be careful not to conflate the Open Government Partnership with an open government movement, firstly. And then secondly, that information needs to be actionable, to be meaningful. Otherwise, this is just going to be another NGO campaign. We need to create stuff that people can use without being funded to use it, so that's something that they would need or want to use on their own. And then just something that was said in an earlier session is we need to also find ways of breaking down the ghettos between the various initiatives and starting to create linked data and also linked initiatives. And media could be a partner. If you treat media as an intermediary, you're going to get an advertising invoice, because then it's simply propaganda or space that you're asking for. If media are treated as a partner, then they'll come to the party because there are such aligned interests here that there are common areas that we could work on together. Thanks.
Justin, thanks very much. So a really interesting sense of what's happening from the ground up in Africa and beyond the kind of mainstream media, but also some important messages there. Don't conflate the OGP with OG, the importance of having data that is understandable and relevant to people, amongst many other good points. Finally, for another, I suspect, different perspective again, we have Jacqueline Pechard, who is the Information Commissioner in Mexico.
Thank you. Thank you for having me in this panel, even though I'm not a journalist. So I just wanted to answer this question about government and media being friends or adversaries. I do think that the dilemma is not, that is not the dilemma for me. I agree with I'm going to quote Jeremy Bentham. He said, "The eye of the public makes the statement virtuous." And I do think that it's important to understand that open government is not only good for the people, or should not only be considered as something that the people can use and reuse, but is something that is good also for the statement. Now, I want to tell you about how it has worked in Mexico. There is a sort of contradiction between what happened when in Mexico the RTI law was passed in Congress. It was actually the result of a movement that was headed by the media and academics. They headed a movement towards having an RTI law because journalists found that having information released, but information that was not traditionally put out or released. And so the media became a sort of ally of the information commissioners. That is, information commissioners have always had the media next to them, the mainstream media. While when having this open government initiative, when Mexico joined the open government initiative, we have seen that the media are not interested in OGP. We have tried to ask the media to come with us, to accompany us in this process, and the media say, voluntary information released from the government is not attractive to us, while information that is taken away from the government through RTI, that is something that we're interested in. So this is a sort of contradiction that I find there, and that is why I think that it's important to find a link, that is a way to collaborate between RTI and OGP, because only open government through voluntary decision, that is, it's the government that decides which is the information that should be released, even if it is through a dialogue with civil society. Anyway, there are lots of information that should be released and that come through the RTI Act. So I would only like to say something so as to, to try to figure out one big thing that the media could do this, or could do so as to contribute to open government, and that is, we do have action plans where we have proposals from governments that were discussed with civil society, but then we don't know what, and we do evaluate if they were really, if those propositions, if they came to life, really. But I do think that the media should see how they are, these commitments of the government through open government, what is the impact of that on society? And that is what I think that the media could do, because media generally analyze information, they compare information, and then they just examine it, and then they come to conclusions. And I do think that that is what media should do, but they first, at least in Mexico, have to get engaged with open government, because they think it's something that is just given freely to them instead of them getting them from the government. Thank you.
Okay, Jacqueline, thank you very much. So a challenge there for media to engage with the Open Government Partnership and with the Open Government Movement and start to act part of intermediary, if you like, between government and the public. Now we're going to open it up to questions. If there's anybody watching the live stream, I've no idea if there is or not, but if there is and they want to join in, On Twitter, you can tweet a question to me at Sambrook, and I'll try and bring it into the discussion. But let me open it up now to the floor. Who'd like to start off? Yep, got a question in the middle here. Could you just say where you're from, and if your question is for a particular panel member, please say so.
Thank you very much. My name is Biondi. I'm a student representative and young ambassador for Open Government Indonesia. I don't have a question for any particular panel, but it can be freely answered by anyone. Now, I think the media has always been praised as the fourth pillar of democracy, where it capitalizes civic participation and can correct misconduct of government. But however, this term can sometimes be abused by the media when it's being too close of a friend. It's actually owned by politicians, where it starts to black campaigns to the opposition and only highlights positive achievements of the politicians who own them or who work with these media. Now, and could probably serve certain agendas, be it financially or politically. Now, my question is that what can we do to ensure that check and balance would always be in place? Because I think media should neither be friends nor adversary. It should remain neutral at all times. Thank you.
Okay, so the question is about the political capture of media outlets and media channels, and what can be done about that. I mean, who would like to start on that? Justin.
So I think that's a very real problem, not just in Africa, where I've got better insight into it, but I'm familiar with very similar concerns in Eastern Europe or New Europe. I'm not certain how you kind of name it these days, where many media outlets are actually owned by either oligarchs or by people with very strong political connections. We're trying to tackle it in Africa at the AMI through a code that all of our member companies have now subscribed to, which includes revealing who the beneficial owners are of the media companies. So mapping out, firstly saying if we're demanding transparency from governments and from others, we need to live up to that same kind of rhetoric. So we're busy going through the process at the moment. It's just been adopted. We've got our AGM in Ethiopia, of all places, next week, at where it's going to be the first steps and the first declarations are going to be made. And then in addition to that, we're also saying that if we're asking governments to make all of their information machine readable, media should be doing the same thing. So we're busy digitizing and then making available content that are sitting locked in some of our newsrooms. Why is that important in somewhere like Africa and potentially in other parts of the global south? Because these are data scarce areas where you're not awash in more information than what you can use. You're actually starved for locally relevant data and information. So making it available actually sets the tone and forces, in some cases, governments and other large institutions to play catch-up, even if it's just to modify or contextualize the information that's been released.
Thanks, Justin. It's not just an issue for developing countries. Of course, John, we're busy debating the accountability and independence of the media here in the UK at the moment. Have you got any reflections on the political media relationship?
Yeah, well, most of you will know that what happened here was that indeed there's a trial going on in the Old Bailey even now there was a good deal of phone hacking in the News of the World, which was the most popular tabloid in this country, Sunday tabloid, which is now no more because it was closed down by Rupert Murdoch in an act of contrition, which he later deeply regretted. Two of his editors are now on trial in the Old Bailey for conspiracy, phone hacking, and various other things. And from that came the Leveson inquiry, which lasted for some time and came out with a large report and a number of recommendations for a revamped press commission to replace the present Press Complaints Commission, and one which would have statutory backing. Actually, Leveson recommended it be backed by the government regulator, communications regulator, Ofcom. That's been put to one side, but the government's come up with a plan for a royal charter, which would, as it were, be in place of the state. The newspapers, all newspapers, with various degrees of emphasis, have said that this is a return to the Middle Ages, or even before, and have refused to join. So we're at a stage where there's a standoff. The newspapers are saying, we will not join your royal charter, they will not apply for recognition in the system of oversight that you put forward, the government are saying, we're not going to accept your version of a regulation. I've been a newspaper man most of my adult life, and after flirting with the idea that it would be quite good for the state to have his hand in it, I've reverted to type. I now think that it would be a bad idea for 2 or 3 reasons. One, I think it's a bad example for Britain, which is a relatively free, has a relatively free media, free society, to give an example to authoritarian societies of the state coming in. Secondly, I think that some of the best newspaper journalism is in the United States, which has no regulation of any kind. And the real problem, I've discussed this often with Richard, the real problem in this country and in others is the culture of journalism, where journalists on tabloids will, when their news editor says, go and harass this woman, or hack that man's phone, or get the story about this celebrity or this politician in any way you can, they say, yes, sir. What we should be having is a journalism which says, or journalists which say, I can't do that because I'm a journalist, in the same way as the lawyer might say it, or a doctor might say it, or an academic might say it, because that's part of their professional ethic. We have ethics, we've got lots of codes of ethics, but they're, by and large, they're more flouted, or have been more flouted, by being ignored. So I don't think that regulation in this country, Richard may well disagree because he worked for many years and was a distinguished member of the BBC, high up in the BBC hierarchy, and that the BBC is regulated and is an extremely successful operation altogether. But I think newspapers have to remain separate from the state, not because, as the Daily Mail and others say, because this is Stalinism in a new guise, or Kafkaesque nightmares, which the Mail, the Spectator, and others are full of. I don't think this government wants to control the press any more than previous governments. But I do think that separation between the press and the government is a principle worth preserving and should be preserved.
Thanks, John. So
I just want to respond, because I think he meant that in Indonesia, many of the media are owned by people who have decided to run for politics. And so, of course, there's this contradiction and conflict of interest. And right now, we are trying to figure out how to manage it. In a country with so much corruption, it's almost impossible to be able to control it. However, we do have a culture of journalism. The nature of journalism in Indonesia, mainstream media at least, is still very much adversarial against the government. We are critical of the government by nature. It goes back to our struggle for independence against the Dutch. And so we still have a little bit of this. Plus, we have media watch organizations, Watchdog, which will monitor the reporting substance of certain media. And this particularly involves the TV, not as much the print media, but television, who bring a lot of revenues, hence owned by tycoons who want to be even more powerful by running for politics. But we also have the General Elections Commission, which also monitors all the campaigning by the media and how it's done. Let's hope it works.
Thanks, Uni. So political capture of media, or the media's capture of politicians, it's a problem either way round. We had one question behind you and then the gentleman here. So the lady in the middle, halfway down, and then the gentleman in front.
Thank you. My name is Keila Leon. I'm the director of the Peruvian Press Council, which is an independent organization of media, print, television, and radio media. And I have a question which I will put into perspective because of our experience there. And I wanted to know how how you could link national security and at the same time open government and transparency. A decade ago, we had a very interesting experience. We were coming out of a dictatorship, a democratic dictatorship of Fujimori, and we were able to sit down with the higher echelon of the armed forces, and we we wrote a paper called National Security and Access to Information. During 7 months, we went through all the information that, if revealed, could be, in fact, dangerous to national security, internal and external. And this information, this paper, which is part of the Lima Principles, is now very much in use because of a new legislation, a secrecy legislation for the purchase of arms in Peru. And at the same time, last week there was a new law about it's called delitos informáticos, which I don't know how to translate right now. It's but it has to do with databases and whistleblowers and whistleblowers strictly related to national security information. So, knowing what is going on in the States and in Britain, especially in the United States, with the tappings and how journalists are being harassed and put into jail, I would like to know what kind of alternative you would find for journalists to be able to do their jobs and at the same time not be in this situation, no?
So how do we manage that tension or that balance between national security and openness? Who would like to take that on?
That's a much shorter version of what I said.
Jacqueline.
Yes, probably it's because in Mexico we have had several years of having violence all around the country and organized crime threatening the state institutions. So I do think that I could comment a little on that. And it has to do with not with open government, but with access to information. That is, if you have an oversight body that is really independent from the country and that has enough power so as to decide whether the information is really something that might affect national security or not, because generally national security agencies tend to say everything has to do with national security, so don't give away any information, for example, from the armed forces or from police. And so you have to analyze the information and consider whether it may be released or not. But you have to have someone independent from the state so as to analyze whether it is going to be information that might affect or not, the activities of the armed and the police forces. But I do think that is necessary. So I'm really surprised in a negative sense hearing from this new law in Peru, because Peru was working so as to have an independent oversight body related to RTI.
How's the debate playing out in the States, Jay?
I mentioned earlier about this field called computational journalism that people are trying to develop in the U.S. And about 5 years ago, I put in a grant proposal to the National Science Foundation, which essentially proposed the government funding the development of algorithms and software that would help journalists do accountability reporting. And the peer reviews came back that were bimodal. One set of people said, public interest data mining is too hard. This is impossible. You'll never be able to do it. The other set said, this is trivial. We do this every day in the war on terror. And the ironic thing was that the scientists didn't realize that while it is true that the U.S. government in national security parts has developed great software to monitor individuals, what we're trying to do in universities in the U.S. now is pull some of that software and human capital and algorithms out and repurpose it as tools that would help journalists hold people accountable. So that's one specific thing that research universities in the U.S. are trying to do to alter the balance in terms of national security.
Okay, thanks. There's a question from the gentleman in front here.
Hi, my name is Oren. I'm running an organization called Videra, and we're basically engaging with citizens in places media can't or won't go and give them ability to document their reality. I don't know if it's more comment or a question, but the tight issue with government and the old media or traditional media, because we don't see BuzzFeed, we don't see Facebook, and basically this is how people today are taking information from whatever happening. So if the governments want to open itself and be held accountable by the citizens, till they're going to do and fix the relationship with the traditional media, I don't know how much traditional media will be existing. So it's taken into account in any way.
Okay, was there a question there, or just are you just asserting your view?
I guess if you can talk about, if I don't know who, if the government's at all thinking about it, or thinking about different way to engage with media.
Our government's thinking about new digital platforms,
more
digital
cross
channels
between traditional media and new media.
Yeah, Justin.
If you have a look at people like Twitter, who are hiring data journalists, so they definitely see the crossover. I think that there is still validity and value in legacy media, and that's this analysis and this deep kind of tradition for engaging with and probing systems. So I think that we shouldn't throw them out. Creating those synergies where they can cross-pollinate, I think that's going to be the trick.
John.
I want to hear it, or I'll let you hear it from the mainstream media, which I still work for. Two things. One, that of the websites in the world which people consult for news, it's mainly mainstream media. The most popular ones are, I got to say it, the Daily Mail, not unattached to the fact that they put pictures of starlets down one side and then the news on the other. And then the Guardian has been extremely successful in branding itself as the world's liberal voice, which to a large degree it is. However, it's also one of the world's biggest loss makers, because it's an expensive operation being the world's leading liberal voice, and it's selling fewer and fewer newspapers, as indeed all of us are. However, it's produced a wonderful web presence, and hopefully, before the money runs out, it will be able to monetize that sufficient to keep it going. The second thing I'd say in defense of the mainstream is that as yet, it may happen, and I hope it does happen, but as yet, nothing has been developed in the outside of the mainstream media of what you might call the citadels. The citadels being big broadcasters, big newspapers, big magazines. And the reason why these are valuable for journalism is they have the power, the status, and the lawyers for them to do investigative journalism. Without that, it's very, very risky, or it can't be done at all. In other words, they have the teams to do it. Now, when ProPublica was set up, which is one of the best of the now quite numerous numbers of organizations which do investigative journalism, it's funded by not-for-profits, so it hasn't got a secure income stream. But when it was set up, it is also doing very valuable, very good investigative journalism and giving it away to mainstream media for free. Really. But it's got a big team, and it's got enough money to create a big team, but that's rare now. So what we're seeing is the loss or the shrinkage of big team journalism, which could put out and did put out both good reporting and good investigative journalism and good analysis. And so far, very few things on the web which take their place. And that's, I think, one of the big challenges for journalism in the future, is to reproduce what is now dying. These teams which have the status and the backing to take on governments, take on corporations, take on big jobs of investigation and analysis.
We've got Alex Howard here in the front row.
So one of the things that's interesting about what journalists trained by justice.
Do you want to just take the mic, Alex, so everyone can hear you?
So yeah, Alex Howard, Columbia Journalism School. You all have identified using data-driven journalism an issue around school dropout rates. Found it was related to available sanitation facilities. And then worked to create an application which enabled people to advocate to their elected leaders to fix this issue. And that actually had an effect, right? Yeah. Now, that's a really interesting thing. Media organizations saying, here's a problem we've identified in an investigation. Here are the people responsible for it. If you'd like to change it, here's a technical means to get in touch with them and advocate for the change. That may make some journalists uncomfortable, but it strikes me that it's completely squarely in line with all of the different bright spots we've heard about, which are often quite focused upon find a problem, tell us about it, use collective action and technology to organize around fixing it. So the question to the panel, and you can each say yay, nay, or dig in one person or not, is this the role that the media needs to take in the 21st century, or should take, or can take, because it's possible now to do it? Particularly if we all are getting around, this idea that this is not new to people in the social sciences or biological sciences, but that humans are not inherently objective. That we can be, we can be fair, we can be accurate, we can be honest, we can have integrity, but we're not objective beings. We change things simply by talking about them, who we choose to share, etc. Okay, so that's a pretty crucial question for this debate. Should journalists take on more of an advocacy role in this context? Let me have a quick run through the panel. Quick yes or no, or why, Jane?
I think it makes sense for nonprofit media because in part they measure their worth through the impact that they have. So ProPublica gets $10 million a year. They hire 30 journalists. They do 50 deep dives. So at a cost of about $200,000 a story, their funders are asking, what have you generated? And they've released a white paper on this that says, here's what we do. Every quarter we have an Excel spreadsheet that tries to trace out what the echoes of our journalism was, what debates were generated. And I think that type of transparency works for nonprofits. You say you want impact, you chart it, and then you tell the world what you've done. So I would support that for nonprofit media. John?
I think it's happening now. I mean, I think that one of the great movements, which I mean big movements in the last few years, has been the growth, say, of polemical TV journalism. Fox is always quoted, but actually, in some ways more important, are channels, international channels like Al Jazeera, Russia Today, the Chinese CCTV International, Telesur of Venezuela, Press TV of Iran, which pump out a line which is backed by their governments. I mean, strongly polemical, often mixed with, in the case of Al Jazeera and one or two others, really good documentary journalism, but very polemical and advocacy. In China, where journalists, the ambitious journalists are really up against it because the government is getting tougher on journalists, their version of Twitter, Weibo, puts out now news. Journalists in the mainstream media cannot cover things like strikes, usually protests and various other things. So Weibo, which has got something like 600 or 700 million subscribers, has become the medium for news because the journalists go to these things, can't write about it or broadcast it, and put it out in 140 characters. And that's, they say, I mean, journalists, Chinese journalists, one talks to it, that's activist journalism. The same thing to a degree happens in Russia. In Brazil, there's a very interesting group now started called Black Ninja, I think, who are activist journalists who, when the protests were a couple of months ago, went among the protesters, put out information and photographs and polemics and so on, and were part of the protest themselves. They were in no way fair, balanced, neutral, and objective. They were part of the protest. Advocacy journalism seems to me to be one of the great waves in journalism now, but very much helped by social media.
Yuli?
In Indonesia, we have as two kinds as well. There is a tendency to become activist journalism, but it's difficult because we believe in being fair and neutral. So there is a kind of a polemic also on how far a media can go in advocating certain causes, especially to the benefit of the people. It's still a debate, I think.
Justin?
I don't think that you need to cross that line and become an advocate journalist. So the example that Alex mentioned in Kenya was a good, solid, old, feet-on-the-ground health investigation, augmented by data analysis, and then augmented by giving people the tools to say, you've now seen the documentary on television, how does this impact you in your village, your life? And using the power of the background data to let people personalize that story. And then once they figured out that, oh, my kid's school doesn't have sanitation, and as a result, they're probably going to drop out, or their results aren't going to be good, giving them tools and saying, these are the people that you could reach out to try and improve that. And this is not becoming an activist. This is simply saying, you don't have access to a government website to get the department or the ministry's numbers. Here they are on SMS. If you want to engage with them, engage. If not, don't engage.
Old-fashioned public interest journalism.
And it goes back to something you said. It's old media or legacy media generate most of the content that we consume on social media anyway. They're still the engines of content, and print more so than many of the others. What they've lost touch with is how to engage with those audiences. And a lot of the newer media understand engagement. And the NAC is simply saying, how can we improve or use some of these new tools to improve engagement, make it more meaningful, without necessarily surrendering any of the high ground that we had as kind of traditional media.
Jacqueline, do you have a view on this?
Yes, well, I'll speak about my experience in Mexico. I think that advocate journalists are specific figures, that is, figures that have outstanded as journalists, and then they can take the lead as activists. But, I mean, not non-profit, but coming from one of the mainstream media, and just coming out as someone that has a good audience and that can come up with this activist attitude.
Okay, thanks. Now we have about 5 minutes left, so I'll take 2 or 3 quick questions and round them up. If there's anyone on the live stream, this is your last chance. I've got a number of extra followers, which is very nice, but no questions so far. So we've got a question here and one at the back. If I can take them in turn, and then we'll put them to the panel. So okay, your question first, and then to this lady here in the red dress.
Hi, my name is Allison Glick. I'm from the Government Accountability Project in Washington, D.C. And I would probably address this question to Professor Hamilton, but anyone else can feel free to comment. I guess I'd like you to address what I see as a bit of a blind spot in your presentation, if you will. While I think access to data, better analytics, better algorithms, understanding algorithms is all fine, well and good. I think one thing that's missing is the acknowledgement of the political framework that journalists are working in, at least in the United States. You mentioned Obama's first day pledge to be the most open and transparent administration ever. In reality, what we're facing now, 5 years later, is a real crackdown on journalists and, of course, on whistleblowers. Specifically, I'm talking about the Department of Justice uses of secret subpoenas to gather thousands of documents, phone calls, emails from journalists. You have James Risen of the New York Times, of course, facing prison, perhaps for defending a source, and you have journalists who are being rounded up in terms of indictments under the Espionage Act, being called aiders and bettors and co-conspirators.
Can I just chase you to a question, because we want to get a couple more in and we're running out.
Could you perhaps put your comments about how journalists can work with governments better into this real live political context when in fact journalists are facing
very important
rather
question.
Grave dangers?
Great, thanks. And if we could just take a question from this lady here who's been trying to get in.
Hi, good afternoon. I'm Peachy Paderna. I work as the Media Issues and Media Manager of the Department of Budget and Management in the Philippines. I was hoping to direct this question to you, Lee, because there's such a close, cultural proximity. I feel like our problems, from my end in government and from their end in media, are actually similar, and also really similar to the question asked by the earlier asked by the gentleman. How do I say this? Okay, so there's quite a bit of corruption in Philippine media. And the thing is that the instinct is for the public to believe them. And the administration is quite sincere in its, a transparency and accountability agenda. How can we fight? It's really difficult, you see, when individual reporters are paid and anchors are paid. I just want to know how we can demand the same kind of accountability that the public demands of us in government from media.
From media.
Yes.
Okay, great question. So we've only got 2 minutes, so we're going to have to keep it brief. Jay, the US context with...
Okay, so I speak in a monotone, but I share your outrage. I agree with it. I agree with everything you said, and maybe it wasn't apparent from my comments. When I said that journalism should say specifically what they need from government to hold it accountable, that's a way of talking about what you were talking about. And when I talked about Sunshine Week, writing about the failures and successes, this year would probably be more about the failures. So I agree with your assessment.
Yuli, do you want to pick up this?
Yes, Peachy, you're right. In Indonesia, it's called envelope journalism. And yeah, I think it's common throughout Southeast Asia. And it's a battle that we have to keep on fighting. We have ethics committees, press councils, and we do have the law. If the government or anyone feels that there has been some mistruth, there's always the legal way, of doing it. But unless and until reporters get better paid, at least, in my opinion, I think we're probably going to have this problem for some time to come. I think we need to have a kind of a paperless society, or, as they say, more transparency, including demanding of the media to be so, not just the government, but also other sectors of society.
Yuli, thanks very much. That's all we've got time for, I'm afraid. We're at past, and we've got other sessions starting in 15 minutes, so we need to change over. But thank you very much. It's a fascinating discussion. I'm not sure we answered the question, but we've certainly identified a lot of the issues we're all struggling with. So thank you very much, and please join me in thanking the panel.